Hi, my name is Niki. This is The Interventionalist, and today I really want to talk about the medicalization of women's responses to misogyny, particularly through the diagnoses of PTSD and BPD, so post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder, which I'll talk about in a second why those two disorders. But the reason that I'm thinking about this is because I have sort of always had a very deep seated fear of going insane, particularly that word. Like, I've always been sort of afraid that I'm going to go insane, or it's like this inevitable thing that I'm going to experience, which is the loss of my sanity, or like slowly losing my grip on reality. And this is something that I've talked to other people in my life about, and particularly women have echoed that same statement back to me, like feeling like, oh yeah, but we're crazy. Like, we're always a little bit crazy, or we are crazy, or we're going to go crazy. And those words, like in a derogatory way, it's like insanity and crazy and mad, like we're hysterical, right? Like the hysterical woman trope. And I was really obsessed with the concept of insanity a couple years ago when I was like very much in the throes of PTSD. And the PTSD was from an abusive relationship, but I was very much in the throes of PTSD. And if you've experienced PTSD, you know that a large part of it is losing your grip on reality. Like in the midst of a PTSD episode, it's like your grip on reality is like shattered, or at least slipping at the very least. And I became really obsessed with the concept of insanity, and I started reading a lot about it. I read a lot of different books, and one of the books I read was called Misogyny or Mental Illness by Jane Usher, which is a great book. I would really recommend it. But it goes into depth about how essentially hysteria, or to be hysterical, has historically been defined in the context of misogyny, and essentially been defined in the context of stereotypical understandings of womanhood, femininity, and the female body, and like female reproductive organs in particular. And the book was really interesting because so much of it I could relate to, right? Like as someone who experiences misogyny, I can relate to the idea that like every time you react to anything, the response from people, especially like men, is to deem you crazy or dramatic, or you're just irrational. And so when you're responding to somebody or reacting to something, even though it is a valid and reasonable reaction, like if somebody is being really cruel to you, to react in a manner like being upset with that, you're met with this response as if you are inherently being irrational or unreasonable, or you're being just dramatic. And it's like this consistent gaslighting that then does make you feel crazy, because it's like, you're treating me in this way and I'm responding because you are treating me in this maybe like very violent, cruel, derogatory manner, and I'm responding with anger or upset, and somehow I'm the crazy one. Of course you're going to feel insane, right? Like, how are you not going to lose your mind when you're constantly being gaslit for your reactions to things, even if they're valid reactions to misogynistic abuse or misogynistic cruelty or violence? And I read another book by Jane Usher, and it's called The Madness of Women, Myth and Experience. And in that book, that's what I just recently read, which was like really what spurred this video. And in that book, it talks about like what madness is, or how we kind of generally understand it. And it says, the term madness refers to a potpourri of emotions and behaviors expressed verbally or more often non-verbally, composed of a variety of ingredients, any of which may be dominant in any one case. The ingredients are anger, aggression, fear, frustration, confusion, exhaustion, isolation, conceit, megalomania, narcissism, self-dramatization, cowardliness, and difficulty getting on with others. However, which I'll talk about more like in the video, when you're being abused, like you're experiencing abuse, that's usually like as a woman, induced by a misogynistic culture and misogynistic beliefs, sexist beliefs, you're experiencing cruelty and abuse and gaslighting. How could you not respond? How are these not reasonable responses, right? To maybe isolate yourself, to feel aggressive, or to be angry, or to be afraid, or to be frustrated, or confused, or exhausted, when you're constantly met with this like systemic gaslighting, and also this like systemic aggression towards you, and the constant fear and hypervigilance that can come with knowing that if you are somebody that's going to endure the effects of misogyny, you're at risk. And that doesn't always mean that you identify as a woman, or that you are a woman. A lot of it just has to do with the expression of femininity, because historically we tie femininity to womanhood, and because of that, misogyny just groups the two together, and if you present in any feminine manner, it tends to make you a target, and that is rooted in misogyny. And that's a whole other concept, right? Like the particularities of being feminine, and the impact of misogyny in relation to the expression of femininity, even not in regards to womanhood. Anyway, you'll notice in the ingredients for madness, a lot of those ingredients are how we historically have like defined the sort of hysterical woman and like femininity. It's like an exaggerated, there's a quote in this book that says how hysteria and like insanity or hysterical disorders are depicted as essentially a caricature of exaggerated femininity. That's talking about how hysterical personality disorder is depicted in the DSM-2 in 1968. But a lot of these traits are already sort of imposed upon women and femininity as like this hysterical woman, this stereotype. And as a result, madness is then defined essentially by stereotypical womanhood. And there's another line in this book that I think really highlights that, and it says, women are at risk of being deemed mad for simply being women, for displaying archetypal feminine traits, or paradoxically for rejecting their feminine role. It is a conundrum that places all women at risk, even if the risk today is a prescription for psychotropic medication rather than incarceration in an asylum. So then essentially, behaving like a woman means to behave hysterically in relation to these definitions and these stereotypical understandings and how madness has then been defined. But you can't win, right? Because even if you aren't behaving then like the stereotypical traditional understanding of womanhood and femininity, you're also accused of being hysterical or insane or mad because you're not adhering to the stereotype. So you can't win. It's a paradox, right? Because either you fit what it means to be a stereotypical traditional woman in terms of these historical or traditional standards, you're insane. And you go against the grain, you don't behave in that manner, and you're insane because you're not behaving in that manner. And I think that also really brings in intersectionality and the impact of womanhood being mutually exclusive with the female reproductive body when those two things are not exclusive. But I think that like brings in the concept of intersectionality, because there's been a long-standing history of associating the female reproductive organs as the cause for insanity. But the female reproductive body and womanhood are not synonymous. They're not mutually exclusive. So if you are a woman and you also have female reproductive organs, you're going to be considered insane solely for being a woman, and the cause will be your female reproductive organs. And if you are a woman but you don't have these like stereotypical female reproductive organs, you're going to be considered insane because you don't have the right reproductive organs. So it doesn't even matter. At that point, any woman, in any way that she is a woman and all that her womanhood is negated and replaced with the concept of madness or insanity. And you essentially can't win. All women, in some way or another, are put into this box of insanity. And linking the concept of madness or insanity or hysteria to the female reproductive body is something that goes back millenniums. It's a really old idea. It talks about it in this book. Like, here's a quote from it. While Hippocrates may have first coined the term hysteria, it was Plato who memorably attributed women's disorders to the wandering womb in Timaeus, published in 91 CE. Plato saw the womb as an animal which longs to generate children, claiming that it could be found straying about in the body and cutting off the passages of breath, where it impedes respiration and brings the sufferer into the extremest anguish. Okay, so there's also like different concepts around this that where like the female body apparently produces different kind of bile and that makes it like less sane and all this stuff. There's all these like ancient ideas, but essentially all go back to the same thing, and however they were defined depending on the era or the time, that the female body is somehow inherently, somehow the female body has an inherent link to madness or insanity, or inherently will cause that, and thus making people who have female reproductive organs targets for this diagnosis, this unfair misogynistic diagnosis. But even if you identify as a woman and you don't have female reproductive organs, your body still is the problem and why you are apparently insane, and that you will continue to face violence and misogyny and abuse. The author of the book that I'm talking about, Jane Usher, she also was an author, a contributor to a journal article about trans women of color and the violence that trans women of color face in particular. And it talks about how, here's a line from it. It says, transgender trans women are at a higher risk of sexual violence than cisgender women, with trans women of color reported to be at the highest risk. And it also says, international research indicates that people who are transgender experience a significantly increased risk of sexual violence compared with the cisgender population. So all women face the impacts of misogyny and the violence and the abuse And the intersectionality and the different marginalized identities that you might hold in addition to being a woman will impact the amount potentially of sexual violence that you may experience or misogyny that you may experience. But at the end of the day, what it comes back to is it really is so much of what determines our womanhood and thus our ability to apparently be sane is our body. And no matter what we have or we don't have, we're robbed of the capacity apparently to be sane. You can have the right biology for a woman, and you're still insane because you have that biology. And then you can have the wrong biology for a woman, which again, these are all like constructions. These are not, it's just transphobic, sexist, misogynistic ideas, but you could have the wrong biology and then you're insane because you don't have the right biology. So it doesn't matter what body you have, your womanhood will always be stripped from you and replaced with madness. And this book like really speaks to the idea of pathologizing women, right, in their responses to misogynistic abuse and the misogyny that they face. And it goes into detail particularly regarding post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. And in this, there's a line in it that says, manifestations of madness ascribed to significant proportions of the female population, borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. But I'm going to focus on BPD and PTSD. And it also says, I think this is important, it says, as societies change, so do definitions of disorders, even though there may be continuities in symptoms and professional treatment practice. Thus, while neurasthenia and hysteria may have virtually disappeared as diagnostic categories today, we now have borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, or chronic fatigue syndrome, which share many common features with their 19th century predecessors. So essentially, the idea that has followed us and that continues to follow us is that women display any behavior, but because of misogynistic cultures, simply existing as a woman, the displaying of any behavior puts you in a category. They're deemed mad, and now they are being pathologized for it. And now their responses to misogyny and the misogynistic abuse and violence and cruelty that they face because of misogyny is medicalized. And while there is an aspect of medicalization when it comes to things like this, like, right, getting a diagnosis for PTSD or BPD, sometimes it can feel like a relief, like finally you have a word to make sense of how you feel or what you've been feeling or the way that you behave in ways that sometimes don't make sense. Like someone who has OCD and bipolar 2, I know that in some capacity, my diagnoses were really helpful for me to just not feel crazy, actually, ironically, because I had a word for it. But the problem with that is now you're medicalizing reasonable responses and you're pathologizing reasonable responses to misogyny, which is inherently violent and repressive and leads to disproportionate rates of violence and assault towards the female population. So instead of focusing on the actual cause of these responses, you've medicalized them and you've turned them into symptoms, but they're symptoms of a greater problem. But instead of trying to treat the greater problem, which is misogyny on a social, political level, you're trying to treat the symptoms within the affected. And I just think people need care directly, the affected need care directly, right? Through, if you want to like diagnose it and call it these things, to give the care necessary in order to like function and feel okay and live with the symptoms that you might be experiencing from the abuse that you face that has been heavily impacted by misogyny. The real issue at hand is misogynistic cultures and misogynistic systems and systemic sexist oppression. Like, if there's a global pandemic like we just had a few years ago, so COVID, you treat the affected, obviously, to try and limit the spread and also to treat the affected in general, but you try and stop the spread. You try and like stop what is actually causing the spread. You focus on the virus itself. We put like millions and billions of dollars towards funding to try and stop the spread of the virus by trying to maintain or manage the actual virus. But when there's something like misogyny and you have millions and millions of people being affected from the spread of this thing, all we're doing by medicalizing it is focusing solely and directly on the symptoms and the side effects, and now telling the people who are affected, you have an issue that you need to fix in order to be a functioning member of society and to be seen as normal or to feel normal or to not be crazy. This is your issue you need to fix. When in reality, the issue lies within our system and within our cultures, a misogynistic culture. And it's funny because it made me think of the term or that phrase that's like, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And it's kind of, I think that concept applies, which is putting women and people affected by misogyny in positions where they're going to continuously face the effects of misogyny and all of that includes, which is often a lot of violence and oppression and abuse, and then telling them that they should respond differently as they continue to face the same thing over and over again because the actual root issue is not changing. And so their responses are not going to change. And now you've given them like a lifelong diagnosis to feel crazy over and feel like they're just broken and they're never going to get better, or they're damaged, or it's on them to work really, really, really hard to fix themselves with this medicalization of their symptoms, while the thing likely heavily contributing to their symptoms doesn't get treated. There's actually like a quote from the book that like really heavily touches on this, like why the medicalization of women's responses to misogyny is a problem, even if it can like be helpful to have words to describe the impacts. And it says, one conclusion to be drawn from this considerable body of research is that sexual abuse and violence drives women mad, literally, leading to major depression, PTSD, BPD, or schizophrenia. However, this is a problematic conclusion as it medicalizes women's misery and again positions the problem within the woman, whose reasonable responses to trauma, in the words of Sam Werner, are decontextualized as psychiatric symptoms. Diagnoses are assumed to reflect an underlying pathology or women's greater vulnerability in the face of stress, rather than simply being descriptors applied to women's lived experience of violence, their coping strategies in the face of an untenable situation, or the adoption of a culturally constructed script for sexual violence survivor that women are taught to follow. And I think that really speaks to the point in particular that, yes, we need words to describe the impact and what so many people are experiencing, the pain and the confusion and the anger and the exhaustion, like the things that we use to describe madness that also really heavily overlap with conditions like PTSD and BPD, which I'll read the criteria for in a second. And we need words to describe what is happening to people, and also for ourselves, it helps to have words to describe what is happening to us. But the problem is, like this says, is that it places the problem within the affected, and it sort of diverts attention away from the actual issue at hand. Because things like madness and insanity or hysteria are culturally contextualized. They're contextualized through the political and social environments that they're in. And if we only focus on the affected and their symptoms, we'll never focus on the actual root of the problem. And while it can be helpful to have these words to describe what we're experiencing, like PTSD and BPD, the problem is now you've been medicalized as a victim of misogyny, and your symptoms are now medicalized, and the responsibility is placed on you to do better, to change, to do all this work to change the way that the world is affecting you while the world doesn't change. And the impact of getting a diagnosis like these things can often feel quite earth-shattering and can kind of sometimes feel like a death sentence. That sounds like really dramatic, but as someone who has diagnosed PTSD and a year ago was in a treatment center for it, because I did truly start to lose my grip on reality, and it's part of the reason that I was so hyper-focused on insanity, because I felt like I was like slipping into it. The diagnosis of that, yes, it like gave word to what I was experiencing, but it felt like a death sentence. Like I was going to be stuck with this thing forever, because no one really tells you can like heal PTSD. It kind of is just like you learn to manage it and it gets less intense over time. But it's not really seen as something that just like you get a cure and you're done, you take a pill and it like goes away. And also borderline personality disorder, like these are considered lifelong disorders that you have to manage, and the concept of being cured of them is very different than like getting an antibiotic and taking it for a week and being cured. Like these are considered lifelong things. And so when you're getting a diagnosis like that, you have this major responsibility put on you to manage your symptoms within a world that continues to behave in a manner to cause those symptoms to arise. And how could that not drive anyone a little bit mad or make them feel insane or feel like they're being gaslit? But then again, you make yourself the problem. And I think another issue that comes up when talking about this is that we then are experiencing the side effects of being traumatized because of the immense trauma that can come with experiencing misogyny. And you're experiencing the side effects of that trauma. You're experiencing the trauma responses that will come with being traumatized and the effects that it will have on your behavior, your ability to think, your rationality, perhaps. All of these different ways that trauma affects you. You're experiencing the side effects, whether or not you know that you are traumatized. And because you might not be aware of the fact that like you are traumatized because of these misogynistic practices, you think that the way that you are behaving or your potentially out of character or would be out of character behaviors are just character flaws. Because when you're affected by trauma, you don't always act in character, so to speak. It changes you for a while, and the way and the amount that it changes you depends on the experience, but it changes you, and it alters the way that you act, the way that you speak, the way that you hear things, and the way that you say things. So much of the way that you move through the world is impacted for an extended period of time, potentially, because of trauma. And sometimes it impacts you in ways that you're not proud of, or that don't make sense to you, or like turn you into a person that like you don't really recognize. Like sometimes it can make you angrier than you otherwise would be, or it can make you more reactive than you otherwise would be. And because you might not realize that you are traumatized, because so much violence and abuse is normalized within misogynistic cultures, that you wouldn't even deem some of the behaviors that are coming towards you that are misogynistic as traumatizing. You just think that these behaviors that you're now exhibiting as a result of being traumatized are issues within your personality, and now you're being medicalized for it. Which is why this book talks a lot about the concept of BPD and PTSD, but particularly BPD. And the majority of the people diagnosed with BPD are women. And here are the 9 criteria for BPD. Chronic feelings of emptiness, emotional instability in reaction to day-to-day events, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment, identity disturbance with markedly or persistently unstable self-image or sense of self, impulsive behavior, in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, example, spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating, inappropriate, intense anger, difficulty controlling anger, a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by extremes between idealization and devaluation, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats, or self-harming behavior, and transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. Also, something else that this book talks about that also speaks to BPD is the concept of splitting, which a lot of people who have BPD will experience splitting, which is like a form of, it's like a dissociative symptom. And I'm going to talk about in a second, like how that also plays into the way that the patriarchy and misogyny can cause women to feel sort of insane or disassociate. But if you look at those criteria, they're not that far off from how madness is defined, but they're also not that far off from how women are often perceived, and they're not that far off from PTSD and the way that you experience PTSD and the different ways that PTSD can manifest, the way that you can get angry, you can start to disassociate, that you can like have all these different ways to try and cope that don't always make sense. And because of that, all of these things are so heavily interlinked, or at least incredibly similar. It's hard to sort of not associate these criteria for these different diagnoses as just sort of natural responses that women would have to misogynistic cultures in different ways. I mean, if you look at the BPD criteria, it's talking about impulsive behavior, identity disturbance with markedly or persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. I mean, women are disproportionately affected by like issues related to self-image, like body image. Our idea of ourself is like heavily distorted between media and our own experiences because it's so heavily sexualized in the media and objectified. So we then struggle with like having a subjective experience or understanding of ourselves because we've been so heavily objectified, and that's what we're witnessing, that we begin to self-objectify and then almost strip ourselves of our own subjective rights or experiences. The inappropriate and intense anger. I mean, when you're consistently being gaslit by a system that doesn't believe you because you're a woman, or calls you dramatic when you react to anything because you're a woman, how could you not be angry when you continue to see statistics or your loved one experience the horrifying side effects of misogyny and misogynistic violence and abuse? How could you not be angry? And that's just another concept in general, but the idea of what determines anger as appropriate or inappropriate, that's a problem. Because like when you diagnose somebody like with BPD and you say that they fit that criteria, they have inappropriate anger, who is defining inappropriate? It's most likely, no, it's not. It's not the people who are experiencing the anger. And if you, again, are in a misogynistic culture, it's being defined in misogynistic terms and terminology and a misogynistic culture. And one of the symptoms, as we talked about with BPD, is disassociation, or the concept of splitting. And there's actually a quote in the book that talks about this like sort of concept of dissociative splitting, but in a different context. And it says, at adolescence, girls have the cognitive capacity to describe and reflect on their initiation into the codes and scripts of patriarchal womanhood. Thus, they signal the onset of disassociation, the splitting of the mind from the body, thought from emotion, and self from relationships, leading to a loss of voice and signs of psychological distress. Listening to girls sparked the realization that the initiation into the gender codes and scripts of patriarchy bears some of the hallmarks of trauma: loss of voice, loss of memory, and consequently, loss of the ability to tell one's story accurately. Once a woman has internalized the norms and values of a patriarchal order that requires her to care for others while silencing herself, she finds herself, in the words of Jean Baker Miller, doing good and feeling bad. I don't know if that's how you say the name. But it's really a mindfuck, right? To exist within a system where as you get older, you watch the world around you change, and the way that it looks at you and what it expects from you changes. And a lot of that change is based in gaslighting, and gaslighting you, as like most, if not all, marginalized communities are consistently gaslit, because you are you and you're who you have always been. But now suddenly you've hit an age and you've been initiated into these codes and scripts, and the way that the world is treating you and what it expects from you has now changed. And here's like an example, right? Like, you're a child, and so you're living in like the state of childhood and child expectations, and that is also continuously affected by these things, right? But you get initiated into the codes and scripts of the patriarchy, and suddenly when you talk, your voice doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything because it's dramatic. When you tell a story, it's just hysterical, or when you have reactions to anything, or you have responses to anything, or you have feelings about things, you're hysterical and you're crazy and you're irrational and you can't think straight. All of these different ways that suddenly the world has decided that your voice is unreliable, inconsistent, doesn't matter, solely because you have been initiated into this code and this script and this patriarchy. And how could that not cause this like immense split inside of you, this disassociative split and experience, to know that you remain the same and that you are still a person with a voice and an internal world and a subjective experience, but suddenly on the outside world, there is this objective understanding of you, and it's objectification and the imposed idea that you are hysterical, that you're less rational because you're a woman, all of these different ways that the world now perceives you as something that does not have a subjective experience and whose experience is not rationally reliable to hear. And so you feel crazy. You start to feel crazy because the world around you, suddenly it feels like you are like in this glass cage and you're screaming and no one can hear you. And when someone does hear you, it's like it's like you're speaking through a translator and the translation never gets it right and they hear something completely different. And the translation will always be seen as less valuable or less reliable because it's filtered through these misogynistic ideas and ideologies. And it's funny because when I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the way that I've always been sort of afraid that I was going to go insane, and the research that I've done on that, and then actually experiencing really intense PTSD because of an abusive relationship, the ironic thing is that PTSD was not that unfamiliar. The major symptoms that I now experience, or that I was experiencing at that time a couple years ago, those were not unfamiliar feelings or experiences. They felt quite inherent to my life and my life experiences, which is why I think this is so important to talk about, which is the way that women experience what we would now medicalize and call PTSD, sort of naturally as natural responses to a misogynistic world, and then they become medicalized. But we continue to face those or feel those effects, and those are confusing and disorienting and at times debilitating. And so you're kind of just microdosing all of the time the effects or the feelings of, or the experience of PTSD because of your existence within misogynistic culture and experiencing abuse and violence because of misogyny. And that's really, I don't know, that realization suddenly made a lot of things make sense to me, because I always felt crazy. And then when I actually started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, and was arguably because of my actual diagnosed PTSD, that needed at that point, the medicalization was a helpful thing. It made a lot of sense to read the book by Jane Usher that talked about misogyny or mental illness, and this book too, and see that there's a reason that this wasn't that these symptoms were not that unfamiliar to me. And part of the reason that I think I stopped myself from getting a diagnosis or getting help or believing that I had PTSD for quite a long time was because this was kind of a similar state to what I had like always experienced, just on a much more extreme and grand level. But the symptoms themselves were not that out of the ordinary for me to feel sort of like I was losing my mind. Like my experience of the world and what was actually happening was not like congruent, because you're being gaslit as a woman because suddenly you've been initiated into these codes and scripts, and the world in front of you like will never treat you as a person experiencing something subjective, and they rob you of that. And so that does make you feel a little bit crazy, because now the outside world and your internal world, they never match. And another thing I really struggled with my PTSD and like wanting to actually get help or believe it when I was told that I had PTSD is because I just assumed I was dramatic and I was being crazy, and my response was because I was being hysterical and dramatic. That's kind of what I assumed about myself, and that's why getting a medical diagnosis felt like I was being silly or dramatic, because that's just who I am. I'm silly and dramatic, and I can't actually be traumatized, or I can't actually be experiencing symptoms this severe because of trauma, because everything that I do is already inherently overly dramatic. And those are ideas that I have internalized because of misogyny. And so experiencing misogyny and experiencing sort of that like microdosing of these PTSD symptoms most of my life, when it actually like came to a head with an actual PTSD diagnosis because of an abusive relationship, I felt like I wasn't allowed, or I wasn't capable of actually being this impacted by something, because I wasn't capable of ever being anything else, which means I wasn't capable of ever being anything but dramatic. And PTSD, like severe PTSD, is dramatic. I mean, it's just large, it's just big, and it can be really loud, and it can just be intense. And I guess maybe the word is that it feels dramatic. And a lot of the stereotypical understandings of womanhood and femininity that we see, these like very harmful and offensive tropes related to womanhood and femininity, is that it's loud and dramatic and it's over the top. So to me, I'm having these really severe PTSD symptoms, but at the same time, I'm like, but this is how I always exist, right? Like, it's just a little bit worse than usual, but this is who I always am. So this isn't anything. This can't actually be like a disorder now, because this is just like what I am naturally, is like overly dramatic. And maybe as I get older, I'm slipping into this insanity that I've always been afraid of, and that's why it's getting worse. But it can't be because I'm traumatized, and also because even if I am traumatized, like, I don't know, that self-gaslighting where it's like, even though I am traumatized, it's like, I'm making it up. Do you know what I mean? Like that feeling of when you are traumatized and you're experiencing these symptoms, these like really severe symptoms because of trauma. And then you're like, but what if I'm just like making it up? What if I am just being dramatic and like none of it's really real or this severe, that like this PTSD. Meanwhile, you're like alone in your room having a breakdown, like no one is seeing it. You're not making it up. You're not doing it for attention. There's no one to get attention from, but those like ideas you'll have in your head. And part of that, I think, if you've experienced misogyny, so much of that already exists and surrounds you solely for being a woman. You know, you're already told that you are being traumatic and like usually making things up and you're irrational. So like when it comes to actually then getting like a PTSD diagnosis or experiencing trauma that way, that you would need to have it medicalized in order to get the help that you need, it's hard to sometimes identify it or to believe that you actually have it, because isn't that what you just like inherently are? Yeah, I guess that's kind of it. I think that's like just like what I've been thinking about, and just really the idea of like, are you crazy? Are you hysterical? Or are you just being a woman in a misogynistic world? But yeah, I think that's it. That's like just what I've been thinking about, and I've been reading a lot about, particularly because I've just been thinking a lot about PTSD, because a year ago today, I was in a treatment center for it because I was like losing my mind. And it just reminded me like what happened last time I was like really hyper focused on the concept of insanity, which led me to thinking a lot about misogyny and the impact of misogyny on that fear of insanity. But if you're someone who is currently feeling like you're losing your mind, like you are insane, or you're being gaslit because you're having reasonable reactions to cruel or misogynistic behavior or violence or abuse or assault, and you're being told that your reaction is unfounded or it's crazy or you're being hysterical, just know that you're not crazy. You're not crazy. You're not alone in feeling crazy. You're not hysterical. And I think it's important to remember that even if you have like a diagnosis like this, it's not because there is something inherent in you that is crazy or insane or like unstable, maybe. There is not something inherently in you that is an issue or a problem or something that needs to be fixed. There are so many things that exist outside of you in a misogynistic culture and in a misogynistic and violent culture that are impacting that. And that is the thing that needs to be focused on and targeted when it comes to trying to treat something. You obviously have to take care of yourself and do all that you can to protect yourself and to manage the way that the outside world has impacted you and made you feel dysregulated and sometimes unstable. But there's nothing inherently wrong or crazy about you. There's crazy does not inherently live in anybody. It lives within social structures and systems and cultural definitions. And it can be beyond frustrating to have nothing around you change that has caused you pain, that has now led to you experiencing these symptoms that have been now medicalized. It is so frustrating to watch nothing around you change that leads to this, and yet you're supposed to change how you respond to it and react to it. And that is beyond frustrating, and it's enough to make anybody feel crazy or feel insane or feel this like disassociative split in relation to like their internal subjective world and the outside world. And if you're currently experiencing that sort of like internal split that can make you feel like you're losing your mind, I just hope you know that you're not crazy, you're not insane, and reacting to things sometimes with a lot of anger or confusion or frustration or fear, that is completely 1,000% rational. And just because the world around you might deem it irrational or unreasonable, just remember the kind of world and the context that you live in. And if it's a misogynistic culture and a misogynistic context, it's going to try and make you feel crazy no matter what, and delegitimize any response or reaction that you have. So even if the world around you wants to deem you crazy or mad or insane for having reactions to things that are being done to you or around you that are really violent, or these like misogynistic ideologies that continue to oppress you and the ones that you love, if they want to call you crazy for being upset about it or for being angry or for responding to these conditions, it doesn't make it true. It doesn't actually mean that you're insane or that you're crazy. These are not real things. These are all just definitions. These are all culturally defined things. And if you have a diagnosis like this, like PTSD or BPD, I just hope you can remember that you're not crazy. You never were crazy and you never will be crazy. You're just a person. You're just existing, and you're trying your best to protect yourself, and your body and your mind is doing its best to live within the context in the world that it is currently living within and protect itself in whatever way that it can. And that can sometimes mean behaving in ways that are difficult for you to understand or sometimes feel out of your control because you've been so pushed to the brink because of your circumstances or the world around you. And when you're in a misogynistic culture that has so much violence towards women and is so abusive and oppressive, I don't think that you can blame yourself for responding in ways or for feeling in ways sometimes that others might consider crazy, like being angry or being afraid or being frustrated. Yeah, I think that's it. I guess that's it. Yeah, I think I'm out of things to say. But I really just want to like make sure that that's clear. Like, you're not crazy. You're not crazy. And if you're feeling crazy right now, you're not alone in feeling crazy. Okay, yeah, that's it. I will end this by saying that I have a website, and if you have any thoughts on this, literally anything at all, if you want to share your experience or just thoughts on the topic in general or any thoughts about anything at all, I have a submissions page, and I would love to hear them. I would be honored to hear your thoughts or your experience, and if you would like it uploaded to the website, I would be happy to do so maybe others can see it and relate. But if you just want a reason to talk about it and to have someone see it, I'd be honored to read it, and it can stay between just us. But on that website, there's also a published submissions page, and there's a lot of pieces that recently just went up that people have submitted that are really incredible and really impactful. And I'll link that down below because I would really recommend reading them. And also just in the comments, if you have any experiences that you want to share related to this or anything at all, or your thoughts on this, please do. I'd love to hear people's experiences or thoughts on this, particularly if maybe you also have been someone that's been diagnosed like with PTSD or BPD. because that's such a specific experience. What else? Yeah, I guess that's it. I mean, I have an email if you just want to email me directly if you have anything that you want to say or want a reason to talk about anything. That'll be down below. And I make videos on TikTok and Instagram if you want to watch those. And yeah, I'm going to be making another, I think I'm going to make like 2 more videos this week. The next one will be also in addition to like the concept of misogyny and PTSD, just a very different angle. And yeah, I think that's it. Okay. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.